All right, welcome everyone. We're now on the fourth reading of the Economics at the End of a Delusion by LaRouche. I'm not really going to go through a recap as I had in the previous weeks. All of the recordings are available. They're there in the description box. We have a lot to go through, and this is a big paper. I think we're on page maybe 20 of 60 or something, or 20 of 64. But it's really worth it. And, you know, like usual, anytime people have something major that they want to get off their chest or a big question, there's obviously a lot of challenging ideas. Feel free to just raise your hand or just kick in. It's a much more informal session than our usual Sunday afternoon class lecture processes. So feel free to ask or share a thought. Otherwise, take a note. And that's, again, something I can't reemphasize enough, the importance of having a little notebook for this type of content, and just write questions to yourself as things come up. If LaRouche brings up, you know, an example of a performance of Mozart's K475 or something to try to make a point of something general that you don't think is related, take a note of what that piece of music is, and then later on go and listen to it and try to think, does it make sense that that piece of music or that piece of literature or poem would be selected as an example that the old wise man had chosen at that moment to try to express or put some meat on the bones of a general idea that may not be directly connected. So just try it out, take notes. For now, I'll do a little screen share and we can get into it. Okay, I'm guessing everyone can see the page. Everyone can see the PDF in front of them. All right, good. I'm just going to scroll down to, oh, I think I overshot it. There we are. We left it anti-entropy versus entropy. So again, we were looking, I think, the previous week's basic concepts of two different ideas, two different paradigms that express different opposing concepts of what human nature is, what the idea of truth is, freedom is. I think we should have a sense of which one of those two paradigms we put our hearts into. Now we're at entropy versus anti-entropy, and how do you conceptualize systems? So who would like to be today's reader?
I'm always on deck.
Always on deck. All right, Peter.
Okay.
You're up.
Can you increase the magnification to 85%?
I can do it even more than that. And who would like to do the footnotes? Usually at the end of every paragraph where there's a footnote or two, we'll get the reader. Who would like to do that today? Kelly? Can you? Oh no, Kelly, you can't really see the words too well, right? So who else would like to be the footnote reader?
I can do it.
All right, Kwan, sold.
Anti-entropy versus entropy. To understand the functional definition of those economic cycles which increase the potential relative population density of a society, that is, generate true physical profit, we must define the way in which individual persons are able to inject an added factor of what must be recognized as anti-entropy into the economic cycle. That brings us into direct confrontation with the popularity of the absurd, currently popularized pseudo-scientific fad of, quote, information theory. The issue, whether or not man is a creature of cognition, unlike the beasts, is inseparable from the issue, as posed by Plato, for example, of whether or not sense perception as such affords the mind a competent representation of that actual experience which prompts our sense perceptual images. In the history of ancient through modern philosophy and science, the effort to reach a rational form of conclusion in this matter of sense perception has been reduced to two general types of results. In these systems of the first type, the believer is constantly confronted with the evidence that the behavior of the processes in which he is situated is not fully consistent with the assumptions deduced from sense certainty. This persistent inconsistency within the domain of sense certainty has repeatedly driven the philosophical reductionist into wild-eyed mysticisms, and therefore sometimes also into conducting religious wars. Among the one type of cases, we include all superficially rational systems which sought to defend sense perception from intrusions by cognition, such as the systems of Aristotle, the modern empiricists, Kantians, and such devotees of Bertrand Russell as Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann. The most typical expression of this is therefore found in those known as the reductionists. In contrast, in the second contrary type of cases, such as my own, the same inconsistency attracts the delighted thinker with the prospect of discovering some truth which overturns shop-worn prejudices. This is key for understanding the chief characteristic error common to the otherwise incongruent systems of Ptolemy, Copernicus, Brahe, and to the empiricist Galileo. By assuming that Aristotle's method, as followed blindly by Ptolemy, was valid, or in Paulo Sartri's alternative, the neo-Achaemite versions known as empiricism and logical positivism, they degraded science to the mere attempt to describe nature in conformity with an adopted set of purely arbitrary ivory tower assumptions. They did this without adducing any universal physical principle which would actually resolve the ontological paradoxes erupting from within the phenomena under examination.
Right.
There's a footnote.
Footnote 31.
Typical of the error common to the reductionists on this account are the effects of teaching secondary geometry at a subject whose principles can be adduced without taking physical processes into account. By drill and grill in such ideas about an assumed pure mathematics, the student is misled into such follies as attempting a geometric representation of physical processes, as if to explain what such mere describing of nature excludes from consideration. Compare Bernard Riemann's arguments on this problem in his 1854 habilitation dissertation, which emphasis on the concluding section and also the closing sentence of that dissertation. Bernard Riemann on the hypotheses which lie at the foundations of geometry, Henry White, translation in David Eugene Smith edition, a source book in mathematics, New York, Dover publication, 1959.
These ivory tower systems of the reductionist include the more extremely pathological expressions such as explicit Satanism, or varieties akin to Romanticist composer Richard Wagner's Ring Myth, the Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter cult, or the axiomatically irrationalist notion of freedom associated with John Locke. Bernard Mandeville, Dr. Francois Quesnay, Adam Smith, et al. In these reductionist expressions of defective mental development, the victim gropes in the unseeable. Like Marlowe's or Goethe's Faust, he yearns, as a superstitious gambler does, for some magical power, perhaps satanic, outside the universe, which is wishfully presumed to act upon that universe. If one could but win that mysterious and axiomatically mystical power to service of one's desires.
Yeah, and I just
Reminder
thought
that poor-
just quick here as a side note, even though I do not necessarily agree with his characterization of Lord of the Rings into this barrel of what he's saying about this problem of how people will sometimes attribute meaning to symbolism in order to get attributes or capacities that are outside the universe, which, I mean, this is part of the recipe for any type of occult secret society throughout the ages, at a point of real mental self-sabotage for anybody trying to go about becoming a scientist without thinking that there is a process of creativity behind the formula that you were told to memorize and repeat and apply. You know, if you just treat the formula as if the power resides in the formula of why it's effective, and forget about the creative process of what occurred before the formula became something as a final product of a process of creativity, you're in trouble. But the important idea, though, is this concept of the incommensurability between sense perception, symbolism, and reality as it can only be known through a creative mind. I don't know do people have any questions so far about that general line of thinking, or is it so far so good as far as how he's laying it out?
Well, I'm a little confused on that footnote, reductionism, how he was explaining that. I couldn't quite understand what the point was.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, does anybody have an answer or a thought to help Satomi understand what the difference is between this reductionist way of thinking versus this more potent way of thinking that LaRouche is talking about?
I think that the answer is in the paragraph, if I may. Yes, just maybe 6 lines before the note 31, it's written the neo-Occamite versions known as empiricisms and logical positivism. They degraded science to the mere attempt to describe nature in conformity with an adopted set of purely arbitrary ivory tower assumptions. So reductionism is precisely to reduce something to something else, okay? That's the basic definition. And here we have the 2 traps of the reductionism. First, reductionism to logical positivism, or to a set of arbitrary ivory tower assumptions, okay? And I think what is important here is the notion of neo-Occamite versions. I don't know if everyone know Guillaume d'Occam. He was a 14th century man, okay? I don't remember exactly the years, but I think he died around 1350 or something like that. So essentially a 14th century man who upheld the idea of nominalism, okay? And he's the perfect anti-Plato.
Are you talking about William of Ockham, or who are you talking to?
Oh yes, I
Okay.
said that you're right, because I said his given name in French, Guillaume d'Occam, but
Okay.
you're right, it's William in English.
Okay.
Forgive me, French is my favorite language. So that Guillaume d'Occam, William d'Occam, then asserted the fact that many things are simply the result of a concept, okay? If you have horses, for example, okay? He said that you have a particular horses, you can have this horse, that horse, and the other horse. So 3 different horses, and those physical horse are the reality, okay? There's no idea of horseness, okay? Contrary to Plato, that would go to the idea of principles. So reductionism is the intellectual trap neglecting the universal principles, either by going down to the specific object, that horse, this horse, the other horse, okay, it can be anything. I take the example of horses. And the other trap is precisely a set of arbitrary ivory tower assumptions, okay? And that is the trap of the fake democratic man that was not capable, or who was not willing to climb the ladder of understanding, or of epistemological journey from the mathematical form, NOAA 1 to NOAA 2, which is the beginning of principles, okay, which is the major form of beauty. And we discussed it maybe a year ago about that. That is the trap, because the fake democratic man is not an idiot, okay? He's a brilliant guy. He mastered mathematics, but he tend to present mathematics as an absolute, contrary to, for example, to the theorem of Godel, who proved that there are certain things that you cannot prove, okay? That is the revolution of the theorem of Godel. The destruction of the fake democratic man in a very brilliant manner. Because as long as Godel did not prove that there are things who are true but not subject to be proven, the fake democratic man can run amok, because he said, after all, mathematical forms is the supreme. So we can stop here. But Godel gave the immense service to mankind to destroy it by his theorem of Godel, which the root statement is there are things who are true, but you cannot prove it.
Yeah.
And it forced us to go to the level of universal principle. And with universal principles, like the form of beauty, you go from the fake democratic man level, Diana 1, to the level of the true democratic man, Diana 2, meaning that the man capable to perceive for the first time the first major universal form, which is beauty.
Oh, yeah. But like with economics, I mean, this is like kind of we're talking about economics, that would be so much more like experiential, like, you have to see it, show me kind of a thing. Don't you think? Like, it's not like art where you can, things have to be a little more concrete, don't you think? And when you're talking about financial things, like, 1 and 1 equal 2, it has to come out to some, it's gotta, do you
Yes.
know what I'm trying to say? Like,
Yes, you're right. But the idea is that, I think that you said that, but the true democratic man, or Diana 2, doesn't reject Diana 1, okay? The golden number is still 1.61, okay? But there is something that is beyond the measure golden number.
Yeah.
And that is the difference. Exact, brilliant but shallow. That's what Susan Hoffman just sent as a message. Brilliant is not, but brilliant is, let's say, a first step, but it has to be deeper.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and I would just say, key point, if people were tuned to the idea that economics should be about evidence and reality, we wouldn't be in the type of really bad spot that we find ourselves in right now, where there's obviously been an adherence to ivory tower concepts and mathematical models of what experts who have been told that they can run things like the IMF, the World Bank, international governments and their monetary policies. They've all been conditioned to think that the world runs according to the mathematical models they were taught in university, instead of actually just basically looking at reality, and that maybe reality demands that you do things that involve producing food to sustain the life of people, and not just printing money out of unpayable rates of debts that increase to the point of creating a giant bubble that's gonna blow up, right? So if, Satomi, the world worked as you pointed out, we wouldn't be in this much of an issue. But the problem is, as LaRouche has been saying, people have been sticking their heads a little bit too much into this belief and worshiping of mathematical symbolism, which kind of runs you into a mystical place that kind of gets a bit of cult too. Like they called Alan Greenspan the Oracle. Because he was one of the few people who could interpret the complex derivatives and other mathematical systems that you have to, be processed for years in higher university in order just to be able to read and interpret what these things mean. It's kind of like, but it really is mysticism in a heavy way. And before we go on to the reading,
yes.
Dasha, oh yeah, sorry, Kwan, you have a thought?
No, I said yes, it's
Oh.
mysticism.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Dash, I see your hand up. What's up?
So basically, the way I understood what's just been talked about is that if we were more aware of how the things work or how like the banking system works, and like if all people just took some time to research and kind of like ask themselves questions on like whether is it really the way it works? For example, like before, I personally used to think that, okay, fine, whatever, like this is the system that we live in and this is how it's supposed to work. But when I started asking myself questions, then I was like, oh shit, like it's not how it works. Like everything is a lie. So if we understood the basic principles, and as you guys have said that if we like compare them, contrast them to the way the world works, to the fundamental rules of physics and blah blah blah, then we wouldn't be in the situation. Because
Yeah.
and also people tend to say that these elites, okay, they'll do their own thing and I'll do my own thing, but that's not how it works. And that's the reason why we're in this situation.
Well said. Yes.
Well, like being a bookkeeper, like everything has to have a balance. Like there has to be balance. Every time you put a money in, there's got to be a liability or a debit or a credit. And it has to balance out. And this is where I find it very, when I can see that balance sheet, there's so much more clarity for me.
Yeah. But I would like to give an example of common sense, okay? When the World Bank go to a third world country and said to its government, you should cut education, health care, and after we will give you some money, okay? So what is the usefulness of money if not to help people, okay? So you see there a clear disjuncture between common sense and money, which is only a servant of human being, if you understand general principles.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Let's get back. Oh, yes, Peter.
William of Ockham, is he the famous man with the razor?
That's the
Just
man.
to,
Yeah, and the razor is quite dangerous, contrary to what we think.
okay.
Because most of the time that expression is used to praise him, okay? But he's not a praiseworthy person.
Because what is it? It's like the simplest answer is invariably the right answer to any problem or something stupid.
Exactly. He was against a complex thinking process, which is completely absurd for an intellectual.
Yeah, how to stay a serf 101.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think we left off at the paragraph that ends with one's desires.
I
Yes,
think you're right.
Okay. The mind of that poor fellow presumes that the imperfection of sense-perceived reality, as he misperceives that reality, is sufficient evidence of the existence of some utterly irrational form of higher authority beyond the senses. Adam Smith did this. His lunatic notion of the invisible hand typifies the kind of superstition to which the wishful devotee might appeal for such beneficent interventions as fixing the outcome of the roll of the dice. That sort of invisible hand of Bernard Mondeville and Smith is the mystical authority to loot farmers as prey, which Quesnay's laissez-faire attributes to the aristocratic landlord. So, the pro-satanic Mondeville, the official prophet of the pro-satanic Mont Pelerin Society, saw public virtues as the fruit of private vices, as Mont Pelerin's Milton Friedman promoted drug trafficking. Footnote.
That's just a footnote to a book, a very good book called The Ugly Truth About Milton Friedman by LaRouche and David Goldman, who's now doing other things. But it's a very good book from 1980.
The advocates of these systems have been compelled to acknowledge the existence of some efficient agency beyond the reach of either sense perception or their personal comprehension, which they fraudulently assert, as Mondeville and Adam Smith did, accounts for certain deductively paradoxical patterns in sense perception experience. The so-called invisible hand, as variously presented amongst empiricists such as John Locke, Isaac Newton, and Bernard Mondeville, are examples of this. The same pathological feature appears as the crucial defect debunked by Kepler in the flawed physics of Ptolemy, Copernicus, Brahe, and Galileo. I emphasize, a related variety of obscenity appears in the laissez-faire of the radical pro-feudalist Dr. Francois Quesnay, as Quesnay is plagiarized as the invisible hand of the British East India Company's Adam Smith. There is a real world beyond direct access by the simple senses, but it is in no sense an arbitrary concoction as those reductionist fairy tales are. It is a rationally comprehensible universe. Once we have come to know what it is through the methods of scientific discovery of universal physical principles, in that aspect of science lie the efficient, knowable realities for which the images of sense perception are merely shadows. The same general problem is inherent in Euclidean, so-called non-Euclidean, and related formal systems of classroom geometry. In these ivory tower systems, a set of definitions, axioms, and postulates is introduced arbitrarily on the presumption that sense perception, as supplemented by some antic inspiration, makes these assumptions self-evident. Again, the attempt at making science from the vantage point of such ivory tower, so-called a priori assumptions, is self-degraded into yet another substituting of the mere describing of nature according to those arbitrary presumptions, as Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Brahe did, instead of discovering the universal physical principles at work, as Kepler did. These ivory tower systems have often led the classroom instructor to abuse the students with such absurdities as assertions equivalent to, quote, "We have not yet proved that life is possible in this universe," unquote, or the worst assumption that, quote, "life or even human mentation is a product of trillions of transactions within the framework of purely abiotic transactions within a strictly abiotic universe," unquote. From the contrasted viewpoint, of which my own work is typical, we have the approach which leads into that worldview which is indispensable for comprehension of the origin and functional characteristics of physical economic cycles. In this case, the recognition of the existence of ontological paradoxes in the world of sense perception does not lead to faith in magic, but rather a search to discover experimentally valid universal principles. The most famous paradigm for this second view of sense perception is the use of the pedagogical ruse of the cave in Plato's Republic. What sense perception apprehends is as but the shadows cast on the irregular wall surface of a dimly lit cave. The task of the viewer is to discover and learn to control the unseen object which the shadow reflects. Today, the very existence of microphysics offers an elementary illustration of that point. Fermat's adducing a principle of quickest time from the paradoxical juxtaposition of reflection and refraction is a perfect illustration of the argument of Plato's cave. The role of the reductionists as the kind of lunatics which John Maynard Keynes showed Sir Isaac Newton to have been. Here's a footnote.
We can wait till the end of or I guess it's a short footnote. Yeah, it's just John Maynard Keynes, the Newton the Man in Essays and Biography, where Keynes I think he's the first to really put it this way, that Isaac Newton should not be considered the first of the modern scientists, but the last of the Babylonian priests, because Maynard Keynes had famously purchased and successfully won the bid for all of Newton's papers that nobody had ever seen before, that were being stored in some basement at Cambridge. And he won the bid, finally thinking, you know, all right, now we're going to finally see how Newton was thinking. How did he come up with all of these discoveries we attribute to Newton, the great genius of geniuses? And nobody ever was told how Newton was thinking. He never wrote anything down. He just wrote down formulas that you memorize. And so finally, this chest was supposed to give us the answers. And when he opened it finally at a press conference, it was just millions and millions of pages of alchemy and numerology. Not a single piece of any science was in there. And Keynes was like, well, that's surprising, but fantastic. Because Keynes also is a bit of a priest, a priest himself within the Cambridge Apostles, and made a point that, no, it's actually, you know, Newton was actually a Babylonian witch. And that's great.
But why was
Well-
there a lot of pages of alchemy and numerology?
Because it was his passion.
That was his passion. He didn't really care so much about science. That's a bit of a story we were given about there's stories about how science happened that have been made up and passed down. And when that happens over a few generations, the story can become like a gospel truth, which has life of its own. And so today, a lot of people have been trained to believe, and there's like an electric fence that's been placed into their mind to think that gravity was discovered by fruit falling onto some guy's head when he was sitting under an apple tree. And that caused him to start describing nature and discovering the inverse square law and all of these universal constants that described why planets are held within the orbits around the sun and all of these other things. The reality, though, when you start getting into the political agendas behind what was controlling Newton, who were his handlers, what were the operations that Newton was a part of, you start discovering pretty quickly that the actual discoveries that are attributed to him were actually made by other people who are using a very different method of thinking than the one Newton promotes in his rules of mental reasoning, that he says, everybody, if you want to be a really responsible scientist that's going to be respected, you have to use these rules of reasoning. And they involve things like, do not make hypotheses. I don't. Use your senses and describe nature as you see it. It's literally what he actually says. It's absurd. And you can't make discoveries if you use that method, which is the point.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There's a lot more to be said, but I'm obviously simplifying it quite a bit. Susan, I see your hand up there. You have a thought?
Yeah. So when you bring in like alchemy and what was the other one, numerology?
Yep.
Is that kind of what he's talking about them going off into mysticism?
Yeah, because there's an increment, your logical language that we mentally can come up with in our heads is useful, and it has a certain correlation to the external universe, right? Like, why is it that, you know, if somebody says, oh, everything is arbitrary, everything is relative, that's what a lot of people have been trained to believe today. And it's like, well, okay, but then what about geometry and constructing a square? And they're like, yeah, but that's geometry. That has nothing to do with the real world. And it's like, yeah, well, did you ever try to build a house using 87-degree angles? There's perhaps a reason why it's 90-degree angles that you need to do if you're not going to have a house that's going to fall on you, which you also find within squares, right? Or like circles. Circles are not just something that's geometric. It also is something which you can see is in, as LaRouche often uses this example, in steel beams, they will puncture the beam with circles. So oftentimes you'll see, if you're looking at construction sites, beams that have circular punctures in them. And you're like, well, that means less steel. Shouldn't that mean weaker beams? But in fact, it's making stronger beams because that circle is absorbing all of that tension. It would be a weaker beam if there was more steel, which is counterintuitive to logic. So if you were thinking creatively, the point where your logic breaks down to reality is great. That's the source of a new discovery. if you were not creative, then where you will still observe that your logic breaks down when pressed against a reality. However, you wouldn't come up with a discovery. You would then resort to finding occult, magical explanations for why reality is the way it is instead of being creative. So that's the type of problem you get with Cartesians, radical Cartesians, people, or like Newton was, somebody who was a radical reductionist and thus very easily slipped into mysticism because he couldn't change his way of thinking to accommodate a more organic, natural way of thinking that would help him make a discovery. Whereas somebody like a Kepler, who we've talked about over the previous sessions, was very creative and was able to recognize that, okay, it's where I hit a paradox. I have a language, it's limited because it's only based on what has been discovered up until me living now at this moment. And then there's this reality, which is mostly underdiscovered. And so the language I'm using, when I press it, it works here, it works there, it works for things that have already been known, but for things that haven't been discovered, it breaks. And for Kepler, that's wonderful. And so those paradoxes are the places where he was able to then work his system and prove the harmonic relationship of the orbits around the sun as part of a musical harmony, which you don't get in Newton. It doesn't, that harmony does not exist in the Newtonian system of gravitation. So again, very different. These two people might use the same formulas, but they live in two different universes, if you know what I'm saying. Mentally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting it.
Well, I think that I want to repeat that again, okay? Because the fake democratic man with his mastery of mathematics can do a lot, okay? And he appear very impressive for most people until he touched the wall of something higher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, everything that's happened is a big satanic ritual.
No.
What I'm trying to say is that
I prefer to say the absence of higher principles. Because I would like to, okay, Matt know that is a very own example from me, but I want to bring it forth, okay, because it illustrates reality. Most of the time, for example, one of the banal explanations for moral degeneracy is that those degenerate people live in a too much luxurious life or with too much stuff and so on, okay? That is precisely an example of reductionist explanation, okay? It's not because you have too many stuff or too many things that you become incapable of morality. It's because you were not educated to the higher forms of beauty, goodness, and truth, okay? Because you can be rich or you can be poor. That is not the essential factor, okay? The essential factor is, were you educated to higher principles?
Mm-hmm.
And if you were educated to higher principles with a classical education, which allow you to bring forth beauty, goodness, and truth, you can be poor, you can be average, middle class, you can be rich, but you will still have an honorable behavior, not because of the many stuff or the lack of stuff, but because you have been educated to be in contact with beauty, goodness, and truth. Okay, so another example is Euclidean geometry. Okay, Euclidean geometry is not bad, but it's not complete. Okay, so it's always not the lower things which are bad. It's the absence of higher things or higher principles.
But then back to what Dasha was saying, could any of these systems have maintained a stranglehold on the belief structure of society generation to generation had there not been the artificial and effort, enormous amounts of effort made on the part of certain forces that do, you could only qualify them as, unfortunately, being satanic. Yeah, that's
they have been victim themselves of their lack.
Oh yeah, they've been victimized. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, they could have been,
so
when they were babies, they could have had a very different set of experiences and awoken very different enthusiasms for love, truth, goodness, and beauty. That could have happened. They didn't get that. They got a different set of experiences.
yes,
And
yes, but I have the stubbornness to say that the way to see that they have been victims is better, because the country would grant them too much power. Okay.
oh yeah,
Because
no, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. And we
no,
should.
no,
I don't believe
understood
that
you
the Satanist
perfectly.
thing actually has real satanic power, but the fact that there are people who believe that and act accordingly,
Exactly.
yeah, that's a thing.
So in terms of propaganda for outside, if I may say so, okay, propaganda is maybe a clumsy word, but in terms of strategy for outside, it's better not to say that they're satanic, because people who are misguided or less informed wouldn't have the tendency to grant them too much powers and to have the impression that they are invincible.
I hear you. I hear you. Yeah.
What I was trying to say is that basically by them, they are propagating their version of reality, and by doing so, they're basically casting spells on the whole population, and it kind of resembles a satanic ritual or something. That was it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I
Once
like
again,
that. I think
yeah.
that there's something to work with
Yeah.
there. That's pretty good.
Yeah. And let's say influences.
I like the metaphor of casting spells, because
Yeah.
that's a macro explanation for a lot of cyber warfare, or a lot of high technology that people haven't understood, and just take as oh golly, it's just magic.
Yeah. Well, in medical terminology, there's a word for casting of a spell. It's called hypnosis.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Antonio Gramsci, the guy who created the theory on control hegemony, gave a very good advice. Never use the vocabulary of the enemy, because you give power and strength to him by using his concepts.
Fair enough.
Is that some sort of metaphysical stuff? Like,
No. Antonio Gramsci was a philosopher, historian, and a geopolitician. Okay, and he said that before you get some political change, you have to hypnotize the population into control change, and those control change will bring later political changes. And one of the practical advice he gave: never use the vocabulary of the enemy, because you will strengthen him by that.
okay.
That's never use the vulnerability of the enemy.
The vocabulary, the lexicon.
Oh, the vocabulary. Thank you, Guan Li. Okay.
Yeah, the lexicon.
Yeah.
Mm.
I see that in a micro display in law.
Yeah.
Use the other side's words, and pretty soon, your room for maneuver diminishes greatly.
The best way to weaken someone or group is not to talk about that group, not in public.
Well, I
But,
think it has to be done well. If you're
yes, it has to be done well. Yes,
you can't be sloppy
and
with your terms.
yeah, exactly.
They're certainly trying that right now, aren't they?
Yeah.
Hmm?
You mean?
Wait, but like,
Yep.
if we don't talk about them, then how do we how do we break the spell of the
Well, we
population?
have to talk about them, but not to give them a shining role. Okay,
Well-
because satanic, in a certain sense, is shining. Okay, because it implies power. It's implied real power.
Yeah, but Quan, at the same time, it's not about the word per se, but how the context of how you use the word that gives it the meaning, right? Where they want us to use certain terms in certain ways that they control the terms of how they're used in the definitions. But if you can take the magic or the power out of the word and destroy the sacred cowness of it within the context of a thought development and communicate, then couldn't you say that you're taking their power away?
I buy what you say, but I would say that maybe, okay, maybe it would be more skillful to describe them as mentally diseased.
I'm down with that. Okay.
So they are weak and having mental pathologies. They need medical care.
As all Satanists do.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Let's Susie, I see your hand is up, but is it pressing or do you wanna
I
wait?
just wanted to say, just even in what Juan was saying about they haven't been educated properly, our current education is just so flat, devoid of life. Probably materialistic is a decent description, but real education, like you all are talking about, like you are doing, has such a very real spiritual component to it. It is wisdom, it is beauty, it is love. And that's actually, I think, what Dasha was just asking. So if we're not going to talk about them, how do we, change what's happening or whatever? We're changing it right now. A lot of people talk about, you use the term zeitgeist often, or people talk about, the collective consciousness. And the more we do what we're doing right now, we're altering that for everybody, aren't we?
Rupert Sheldrake would say yes.
I would think so.
Yeah. In some small measure, yes, definitely.
I don't think it's small at all.
Well,
Well,
it's a question of amplitude.
We're changing the vibration, the frequency.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very real, concrete fact. I can't prove it, but I believe it.
And I see that metaphor in the casting of a stone in a still body of water, and the waves
Beautiful.
radiate almost interminably and
Beautiful.
really in an unpredictable fashion, depending on what is out there on that body of water, or even underneath it.
Well, that's going to set the stage very nicely for the coming paragraphs, as you're going to find out in terms of how the whole universe is expressed in the smallest part. This is a theme that all great thinkers always tend to zero in on, regardless of what epoch we're in. So yeah, let's. I actually forget where we left off. Can somebody remind me what paragraph we were at?
We left off at footnote 33.
Oh, right
So
here.
the very last word was bin.
Got you. Okay.
And I reckon I need a reliever pretty soon.
Let's just go from that paragraph again. The role of the reductionists. Just
okay. The role of the reductionists as the kind of lunatics which John Maynard Keynes showed Sir Isaac Newton to have been arises from the fact that, on the one side, they are fanatical slaves to sense certainty, and yet, at the same time, as Leibniz pointed out to Newton and to Antonio's agent, Dr. Samuel Clarke, they themselves premise what they offer as the most precious parts of their theory, upon intervention by an agency from outside the reach of sense certainty. By denying the path to sanity in the existence and role of hypothesis, they impel themselves to worship or fear otherworldly, purely magical and fantastic forces and agencies, for which there is no experimental proof of principle that these fantastic concoctions ever did or ever could exist. Newton's scientific chest of experiments in black magic is typical of the lunacies implicit in empiricism. Since it is in precisely those connections that experimental methods reveal and verify the specific distinctions of man from the beasts, the impact of tolerating the influence of reductionism in education and popular opinion is the denial of the nature of man, and therefore of man's God. Reductionist mysticism is therefore a lie, and worse, implicitly as pro-satanic as the secondary and other pupils who turn themselves into lunatic mass killers of the current time's spread of new violence through such recreations as cultivated addiction to the positivist, reductionist extremes of what are inherently dehumanizing Nintendo and kindred games. The fallacy of each ivory tower viewers as the Aristotelians and modern empiricists was recognized in this or kindred ways by many ancient and other thinkers. The case of the Socratic dialogue of Plato is exemplary. The humanism of Solon of Athens is to be contrasted thus to the psychotic image of Lycurgan Sparta and the Roman imperial legionnaire, or the Nazi Waffen-SS model, which mimicked those legions. The issue served as the basis for the development of modern experimental physical science by Nicholas of Cusa in his De Docta Ignorantia. Followers of Cusa, such as Luca Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci, address this. The line of development of approaches to a comprehensive form of mathematical physics by Kepler set into motion a process leading through Leibniz, Kästner, and Gauss to Bernard Riemann's overthrow of all ivory tower mathematics in his 1854 habilitation dissertation. With Riemann, space, time, and matter, as many had thought we had known them a priori, with assumed self-evident certainty, were banned from all competent physics thereafter. There was no Santa Claus, but only real adults who bestowed loving considerations upon children, in place of arbitrary ivory tower sorts of definitions, axioms, and postulates. Only experimentally validated universal physical principles were allowed. To understand the anti-scientific character of concoctions such as information theory, one must focus on the characteristic problem presented to society by the question: do the individual powers of sense perception represent a faithful image of the real universe around us or not? Understanding this problem shows us how technologies are generated. An understanding of the fuller implication of the matter leads us, in turn, to a conception of the functional meaning to be attributed to the term economic cycles. Are these notions of technology derivable from the interpretation of sense perception, as Weiner's argument and silly statisticians such as Milton Friedman and Senator Phil Graham imply? Or are they obtained, as they are in fact, by discovering ways for overcoming the fallacies inherent in a naive faith and self-perception?
Sense perception.
Sense perception.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I do hope people have been taking notes to review later. I would just say the thing that really caught my eye just last night, actually, I was reviewing some old notebooks of mine, and I had found something that I had written down years ago from Riemann. And I know some people here have encountered the name Riemann from previous sessions. Others who have just come in today have not. But Riemann is somebody who LaRouche often refers to as a very, very, very important figure who was a scientist. And at his most creative output, he died young, but between 1854 and around 1870. And what he did is not really fully appreciated by a lot of people today, but essentially he was a student of Gauss and a follower of Leibniz deeply. And what he did is he took a lot of Gauss's insights into the creation of a new language that would be more in conformity with the actual structure of physical space-time that the universe exhibits. And that would be a space-time that would be open and not closed. So a universe, if the universe is something which is not a finished product, because God, the creator, is not impotent, but actually creative and constantly present and creating at all moments, everywhere, right? To say otherwise would presume that God has both finished the universe and thus cannot make it better, which means that God that had made a finished product would be a very impotent God, because he wouldn't be powerful enough to make anything better. That's a big like imperfection for God, you know, not a very creator God. It's more of like a, I did that already, you know, type of God that's not present in creation. So the question is then, how do you have a language which has that perfectible openness within the actual geometric scientific language, which would be in harmony with that universe? Euclid or Aristotle come up with systems of language and of logic that are static and closed. They presume a limited amount of assumptions that just by memorizing, you could then carry into any investigation about reality into the unknown, which obviously doesn't work, because reality will always surprise you, because there's most, you know, you'll never know everything. Riemann took it as far as anybody ever had, and people like Einstein, Max Planck, Vladimir Vernadsky write within their own works how Riemannian geometry and language is the most important thing to have if we're going to look at systems that are creative, especially life, like Riemann says, or anything like that. And LaRouche says, you know, if you want to understand how to best map out economic systems, the way he's been able to do over the past 70 years before he died, he said the best type, the most compatible language is the Riemannian language. Basically, because it has a whole,
Yeah.
What's that?
Oh, I'm not gonna, I apologize for interrupting you, man, but I remember my calculus 2 professor at the academy talking about Riemann sums in the context of learning calculus. So I'm reading Riemann in these lectures is the first time I ran across his name again in 44 years, and I'm glad.
Yeah, absolutely. And Riemann made the point that that the future of science, and this he was writing in the 1850s, is going to be breaking out of the sense perceptible domain into discoveries of the very large and the very small. So the world of the micro universe and macro, which require a good compass to navigate into, because you're going into the world where the typical thing we've been living with, our senses, and the type of physics that emanate from our senses will not be with us. They won't be that useful. So we need something that's more potent. And that's what he created. And he did it in a very specific and knowable way. But the thing that struck me was that he writes in a letter to a friend that it was by reading Leibniz's refutation of John Locke and John Locke's assertion that there is no such thing as a soul and that we're all just blank slates to be written upon, and how Leibniz was able to refute John Locke, that Riemann says he got the flash of insight on how to make his discoveries in physical geometry from reading Leibniz. And I love that. Especially if you when you start reading Leibniz, it makes a lot of sense, because how does a physicist think of themselves if they're going out as an explorer into the universe? In you know, it's not the physical body that's going into the universe as an explorer would. It's the mind that's going into the unknown. And how do you see yourself navigating through that? And could you make a new discovery if you don't believe you have a soul, or that the universe was created by a loving God in a rational, reasonable way, in conformity with something you have within yourself? Because if you believe the universe is just this, you know, zone of nihilistic chaos, that you're made in the image of this randomized or whatever meaningless, cold universe with no creator or creator that's irrational, how are you going to discover something new and truthful? You can't. So anyway, yeah, Dasha?
It kind of sounds like quantum physics, where it depends from the object, whether the subject exists or not. I don't know. I kind of found the parallel.
It's a good parallel. And Max Planck, I'm going to send you a paper by Max Planck, the father of quantum physics in a real way, who did believe in truth, but he made the point that we need a new way of thinking about the mind of the scientist in order to make the types of discoveries that we're now in, or resolve the paradoxes that we're encountering in the quantum domain. Like, for example, the wave particle paradox, or that when you simply try to look at a photon in motion or an electron, you change its position or you change its speed. So you can only measure one or the other. The very active observation causes the thing observed to move, which is obviously it makes sense, right? Because if you need a photon to hit something and then go back into your eyeball. So it has to like go from the light source to the thing being observed and then back to your eyeball, which takes time. It doesn't happen all at once. But the photon, if you're trying to look at a photon, it requires a photon to hit it to go back into your eye, right? So the very act of hitting it changes it. So you can't see anything in an objective way. And Max Planck, in this paper called The Philosophy of Physics, he basically gets at, he says that the only other thing that has that behavior of changing when it is observed that we could see is the mind of a person. Because just by thinking about a feeling or thinking about a thought that you have inside of you, you change that thought or feeling, right? Like, why am I angry? Sometimes you're just angry for a wrong reason or something, or you're jealous for a wrong reason. And so it's when you start reflecting and thinking about your feeling, the feeling itself changes, or you start thinking about your thought and your thought changes. So he's like, we need to create a new science of the mind to better appreciate this before we start revisiting the question of what's really going on in that atomic domain. And this is where the School of Gestalt Psychologists, because several of his students become the founders of Gestalt psychology, including Wolfgang Köhler, which is very fascinating to realize that there's this direct connection. Like, that's what he assigned as a challenge to his students. Whereas Bertrand Russell, who we're going to learn about very soon, had a bunch of students and lived at around the same time, but he was a very different kind of teacher. And unlike Max Planck, he assigned his students to come up with a practical solution to a set of very poisonous ideas about humanity and the universe, which I'm pretty sure in the next, based on the title of my attack on information theory, I think we're going to get into that, which is, yeah. This is actually one of Bertrand Russell's disciples, one of his top students at Cambridge in 1913 when he published his Principia Mathematica, Norbert Wiener, who's at the heart of today's, if anybody wants to know about the Fourth Industrial Revolution or the cult of information, artificial intelligence, you got to look at Norbert Wiener and what he did by taking his teacher's challenge and doing something really nasty with it. So let's, oh, Susan, I'm sorry, I missed your hand there. Hey, Susie. Susie, you still
Sorry,
talk?
I was muted.
That's okay.
If you want me to not talk, we can just go on, but it just is overwhelming to me. I barely understand most of what we're reading, but especially when you start talking about it, it all comes down to whether you're coming from a foundation of fear or love. Because if you're in fear, you've got all those limits boxing you in. But if you're in love, then you're open and you do have the creativity. And when you bring quantum physics into it, what you focus on gets stronger, more solid, more real. And so that's back to what we're doing right here. Instead of focusing on what these icky, deceived people are trying to create in this world, we are exploring all of the principles that make for a system that has life in it.
Yep.
And we are causing that to grow even as we're learning about it.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it.
So it sounds like you want to put love into the equation of the big and the small.
Well, you got to bring it back into science. Yeah, like love in science should be not seen as.
Well, I mean, like
using
using love as part of an equation.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Very much so.
in a non-flaky
Fear is
way,
this
yes.
tight little thing that boxes you in, and love is just expansive. It's freedom, it's liberty.
Like after all, it's they say it's the biggest force in the universe.
Yeah.
It really is.
It's a nice thought. Yeah, yeah, it's true.
And love is energy.
Yes, it is.
So yeah, put it in the equation somewhere in the E equals MC squared somehow, and maybe you'll figure it out, eh?
All right, let's try to get through a few more sections, but this is good. This is good. Who would like to? I know Peter has an obligation in a few, probably 10, 20 minutes. So why don't we get a new speaker? Paul, do you have people sleeping around you?
No, all is taken care of as far as breakfast and the family requirements.
Yeah. Okay. You want
Yeah,
to go?
no, I'll do some reading for you if you like.
Thanks.
Okay, my attack on information theory. One of the common pathologies of contemporary policies of practice in education is the practice in a taught doctrine.
Okay.
Practice. Teaching of ideas is properly accomplished by inviting the pupil, for example, to experience what the teacher has experienced in the struggle to discover the relevant principle. All honest teaching is biographical and often autobiographical. Yeah, I'll agree with that. So proceed as I did in making my original discoveries within the science of physical economy. It happened during the years 1948 to 1952. It began with my reaction to an early 1948 reading of an advanced publication copy of Professor Norbert Weiner's Cybernetics. You want me to read the footnote?
Yes.
Quentin, read it.
So,
It's just a-
note 34, the Paris edition loaned by a friend who had received a copy from Wiener's daughter. The difference between the time of my reading of the advanced copy and the publication of the US edition is relevant to the way in which the sequence of ancient developments occur in my initial discoveries of that year and the next.
Great. And Paul, you can go, your reading is wonderful. Just go a little bit slower. There's going to be some big ideas. Takes a while for the mind to process.
I was, at first, entertained by Wiener's discussion of some designs, but then angered by that book as a whole. What angered me was Wiener's use both of Ludwig Boltzmann and of echoed effects of Wiener's own Faustian training under the Mephistophelian Bertrand Russell of Principia Mathematica notoriety.
All right. That's
Note
a
30
big
35.
footnote. Might as well just read it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one. So the controversy between Russell and Alfred North Whitehead concerning the way in which the Principia Mathematica was produced for circulation and the way in which Russell's acolytes organized a decades-long vengeful campaign against Kurt Gödel for Gödel's proof against the central thesis of Russell, intrinsically fraudulent book, merely typify the notoriety. As illustrated by that case, Russell and his circles belong to the school of ethics, which teaches its acolytes, if you are caught stealing a church and the steeple is sticking out of your hip pocket, deny everything. But as an added precaution, also order the killing and perpetual shameless libeling of all known immediate members and distant relatives of the families of the witnesses. Global nuclear warfare zealot Russell was not only probably the most thoroughly evil man of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler notwithstanding. In all of this, what is to be recognized above all is that his role in projects such as the effort to eradicate the modern nation state through nuclear terror is not a trait external to his and his acolytes' activities in academic fields. It is an expression of that satanic quality of hatred which Russell himself sometimes expressed explicitly, which motivates their role in the academic fields to the present day. This connection between nuclear warfare impulses and anti-scientific frauds is of the utmost relevance for understanding the character of all the leading Enlightenment, in quotations, and later empiricists to the present day. Well, that was a lot of compliments, but I think that it's a worthwhile to go back to the idea of Kurt Gödel versus the Principia Mathematica, because it's truly at the nexus of my obsession. Be very careful of the fake democratic man because they appear very impressive. And the project of Rousseau and his acolytes at the beginning of the 20th century is to produce that famous Principia Mathematica. And it might sound a little bit laughable to say the thing like that, but it's true. It was the goal of Principia Mathematica, is to prove without a doubt on the level of principles that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, but to say things in a more serious manner is to lay the foundational logical conceptual basis for mathematics. Okay, and if that project was something that was valuable, and in case they succeeded their goal, it means that mathematical form is the supreme representation of reality, that there's no need to go to higher principles. It would be the total victory of the fake democratic man. But since it's not the reality, of course, that project can only be a failure ultimately. Okay, and it was a failure, but not because of the Principia Mathematica, because to be frank, I don't think that many people would be capable to produce the Gödel theorem precisely, because the Gödel theorem was the thing that, let's say in a nutshell, that in maths, what is important is you have propositions who are true and propositions who are not true. Okay, that's the first level. But inside the propositions who are true, before Gödel, it was surmised that everything can be proven. Okay, so it was a project of Principia Mathematica. But Gödel succeeded to demonstrate that everything that is true cannot be necessarily be proven. Mm-hmm. That is to say that mathematics is not a complete system. Yeah. So you need to have higher principles to be the foundation of mathematics. So the pretensions of the fake democratic man, and I'm using Platonic terminology, and if there are people who don't understand what I mean by fake democratic man, don't be shy, as me. So that is the complete failure of the fake democratic man project, making mathematics as the supreme, since there are things who are true in maths that cannot be proven, meaning that we need higher principles to prove those things, and not inside the mathematical system.
Since you brought it up, why don't you just put into words, what is your definition of the fake democratic man?
Okay. I think that it's very important to go back to the Republic, okay? I would say that to put things simple, okay? Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think that Susan, I would use Susan metaphor, okay? Because I think that it would be, because I realized lately that I am a bit academic in my explanation, and it could be a problem. So Susan metaphor of love and fear. 1, 2, 3 are the 3 first steps of knowledge, and it's driven mostly by fear and not by love. So 1 is your understanding of the universe by senses perception, okay? And I would forget the Greek words, because the Greek words are not really important. What is important is your understanding, okay? So 1 is the senses perceptions. 2, it would be the words and the concept, okay? The intellect. And 3 would be the opinions of so-called experts, okay? But the opinion of so-called experts will rely ultimately in the use of mathematical forms. And that is the level of the fake democratic man, okay? Because Plato would make equivalence between your level of understanding of the universe with the kind of political man that you would be. So the democratic man, politically speaking, is the man who is motivated by the appearance of justice. And in terms of epistemology, is equivalent to the man who would define the idea that mathematics is the supreme. Because mathematics being the supreme, you can play with the numbers. And being capable to play with the numbers, you can justify absurd things, okay? And I go back to the practical example I gave maybe 30 minutes ago. Accountants from the World Bank or the IMF can go to a third world country, giving a very complicated plan to the government of that third world country based on mathematical formulas, and ask them simply to cut the subvention, the money given to education or healthcare, for example. And they would mesmerize, hypnotize the government of that third world country with those numbers and formulas. And it's like religious incantations almost. And they would justify in that pseudo-scientific way what they ask, okay, meaning destroying that country. And if you don't take into account those magical manipulations of numbers and just go to the principle of love, of beauty, goodness, and truth, you would never cut education or healthcare just because you want to satisfy some mathematical fantastic formulas, okay? So the example might seem a little bit simplistic, but it's the perfect illustration of the clash between the fake democratic man, meaning the man motivated by the appearance of justice, okay? So he would bring in all kinds of absurd and fantastic formulas to justify injustice. And if you are a man of common sense, you would never accept that kind of thing. And the epistemological level, which is just above the fake democratic man, which is the true one, the true democratic man, is precisely beauty. Okay, so a leader having beauty inside him would say to the representative of the World Bank, well, you know, your formulas are completely absurd. You just get out of my office. I will not take your money. I will keep on to develop my country. Okay, and I will go to powerful countries to protect me against your shenanigans. And that if that government has a little bit of beauty in them and not to be precisely, to go back to the example of Susan, not inspired by fear, but by love. Okay, and the 3 degrees of love precisely is beauty, goodness, and truth. And the transition from the fake democratic man to the true one is truly the difficult step in the journey of the soul or in your epistemological journey. Because once you're in love, once you're in beauty, the transition to goodness and truth is only a question of time. Matt, your micro is not open.
Yep, I noticed that. Thank you. Yeah, let's have one. I know Dasha's got a question, then we'll get back to reading a little bit more before we round it out for tonight. So Dasha, yes.
Okay, so it kind of like looks like these people, these fake democratic men, they are kind of worshiping Baal by basically going there and saying that, okay, this is the formula, you need to do that. And if they don't do that, it means that their worshiping wasn't successful. So And because they believe in this system so much, they by doing so, they're worshiping Baal and trying to like cast spells, and like basically it's Satanism. I don't know why, but it kind of is Satanism. I don't know why I keep going back to it, but
Well, I would concede that it's a form of Satanism because of playing with numbers. It's called numerology, and numerology has always being associated with, let's say, questionable practices.
I would, yeah, I mean, I would just say to that, you know, there was it was customary to refer to this agency as those who worship at the temple of Mammon, being a metaphor used with biblical references to the god of money, the god of lucre. You know, indicating just that you have agencies that are animated by priorities and values that are very antithetical to the actual healthy ordering of human society as it is discoverable and as nature's law, and you know, the creator of said laws made that creation. It's a perversion of that. So you have agencies and powers over generations which are systemically and consistently operating in sort of the inversion of that natural value system. And it causes the mind to go into very disgusting places if you're subjected into that world for too long. And we all have gotten glimmers of this thing, and there's no real red line to how far it can go down into the realm of evil, in the sense of like, you know, is an oligarchy willing to kill, you know, unleash nuclear war? If the conditions, they prefer not to, but if the conditions demand it to be expedient to do that more than, let's say, submit to the moral authority of an order that they don't control, that might involve their being ultimately extinguished, perhaps, you know, like it's something completely irrational in that sense, because it's not even like, by doing these sorts of things, it doesn't even benefit this parasite class who have their mystical beliefs and occult, you know, rituals and values and belief structures that they really adhere to. It doesn't even benefit them ultimately to do these things, but they do it anyway. And so it is a form of like smart stupid, and a certain type of insanity that I think only a few people like Edgar Allan Poe properly understood. Like when you read Poe's Imp of the Perverse or his Fall of the House of Usher, you get a sense that there's a diagnostic that this man was able to perform with, or Schiller does it too in his Ghost Seer analysis as well, of the structure and the psychology of evil from a very high place. It's not an easy thing to just talk about, but they do it well.
But sorry, go.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Joshua, yeah.
They're willing to go this far because they're worshiping the Baal.
I hear you.
Yeah,
I don't want to oversimplify it, but yeah, like they're evil. Yes.
Yes,
They're worshiping,
I would say that
nasty Babylonian stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how can I say it? Smart, Matt, you said smart, stupid. Okay, that's very original. I would say that there's a word that can be used to say smart, stupid. Okay, it's a robot. Because a robot can do things, okay, but it's not really smart. It's rather efficient, okay.
But
And
they are devoid of humanity.
exactly, it's robotic, okay. It's a Borg, okay. So a Borg is efficient, okay. I cannot say smart.
Are you saying a Borg like from Star Trek? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a Borg is a
I'm
kind
down
of
with it.
biological. It's a kind of biological robot, okay. Anyway, that's what they want. Okay, they want the interface between human and machines. And the Borg is a kind of a popular representation of that fantasy, if you want.
Mhm.
And so smart, stupid is a Borg. That is in the sense that I would replace smart by efficient, capable to do things, and stupid not having access to common sense, because Another word which is down to earth, but which is equivalent to love, is common sense. Okay, because common sense
Is not common anymore.
is not common anymore. First, and is also defined by beauty, goodness, and truth. Okay, for a very ordinary word, but that ordinary word is very vast and equivalent to love.
Now, I have a quick question if I could. I think it's to Quan, but maybe Matt too, in a couple of paragraphs back. Am I correct that we actually do have things that we absolutely know to be truth, but we really can't prove them yet? But yet we know that we are needing to discover higher principles to prove those truths.
But Susan, you just stated in your own words the theorem by Godot. Do you want to change it for the theorem of Hoffman?
Do what?
Do you want to change the theorem of Godot to the theorem of Hoffman? Because
Okay,
just
you need to
stated
write that in the chat so I know his name and can go look him up.
Oh, I'll send a really
Yeah.
good video explaining Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's really elegant, such a beautiful little elegant demonstration of what Quan was going through. But yeah, you're totally
that
right.
is
Susan.
true.
Yes, exactly
We-
what you said. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
All right, so that gets us back on track here. Let's get through another couple of pages before we round it out. Just to recap here, we have an irony, and I only appreciated this tonight with this reading as I was putting it into my own sort of words, thinking about it. You have a parallel phenomenon with the founding father of quantum dynamics, Max Planck, setting the stage, both making revolutionary discoveries, also being helped by his own familiarity with Leibniz, who he loves, and Riemann, whom he loves, that allows him to make penetrating discoveries into this new realm of the quantum domain with the help of his good friend and fellow musician, Albert Einstein. Keep in mind, Kurt Gödel is also a close friend of Albert Einstein. And he sets the stage and challenges his students to create a new field of science of the mind that would allow future scientists to resolve the ontological paradoxes that were arising with the breakdown of Newtonian mechanics into the realm of the reality of the very small. And this is what sets the stage for the practical development of things like Gestalt psychology. Max Werkheimer, who again does work with Albert Einstein on the creative process, the creative principle that Einstein deployed and talks about in Gestalt psychology, and Wolfgang Köhler as well. They're all looking at how does the mind go from ignorance to knowledge? What is the structure, the common themes of all minds moving from ignorance into knowledge when they're in a potent, healthy, creative state, right? Not random, but healthy. And they're all looking at, well, what are the structures of a healthy mind? And then you have the parallel thought, the parallel phenomenon of Max Planck's contemporary, Bertrand Russell, doing something very similar, right, with his Principia Mathematica, which is essentially just trying to revive the toxic methodology being promoted by Isaac Newton 300 years earlier, which is why they called it the Principia Mathematica, same name, using the same method of deductive and inductive analysis that is promoted by Newton, which the world finally was breaking away from because of the discoveries of people like Einstein and Planck at that time, right? So he sets the stage for a theoretical new science and then challenges his students, Norbert Wiener being the main one, to go and find a way to create a new type of practical science, which becomes the science of cybernetics and the science of information theory and systems analysis in a few decades after that, despite the fact that Bertrand Russell, unlike Max Planck, never discovered shit. He only described things. He never discovered anything. So you have a whole pseudoscience, this other ideology masquerading as a science, take form with a very poisonous cultural soil that the roots were able to stick into. And that's where we left off here, this question of cybernetics. And
Yeah.
Matt, can I ask you a
sorry.
question on that?
you can, but then we have to read a little bit more just to get to the end of this section. So yes, Mateus, good seeing you again. It's been too long.
Yeah, it's been a long time since we haven't talked. But taking the chance that you mentioned all these scientists that I know that you like them a lot because you talk about many of them. Do you have an answer to why they haven't, they haven't come up with anything practical like Tesla did, or why it's taking like it usually takes a lot of time for this new field in science to come up with something more advanced, because I never really, because I've always been more political, right? And I never really studied a lot of science and a lot of these fields like quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and I understand very little of it. But that was a question that I had, and I was wondering if you had an answer to that.
Can you rephrase the question in a simple way? Just take the essential simple question that you have.
So my question was that is there any reason why modern scientists like Max Planck and you could say like Albert Einstein, because um, um, I don't know who else is modern, but essentially, have they come up with anything practical like Nikola Tesla did? Who Tesla, who died in 1943? Like he came up with something that it's used globally in all modern cities. But the people that study quantum mechanics, have they
Okay.
come up with anything like as much practical as that?
Well,
Does that
your
make sense?
your question.
Nuclear energy.
The advent of the atom and the behavior of the atom and the mass energy relationship is important as an outgrowth of some of that material, that stuff that Einstein and Planck had been doing. That's important. But I would say that your question is sort of demanding almost a side longer discussion about how the younger generation of mathematical quantum quantum, I don't want to call them quantum physicists, but let's say quantum mathematicians, derailed the actual organic flow of new discoveries that were being made by people like Madame Curie, Max Planck, Einstein, and that older generation who had much more rigor and creative attunement. That was not carried forth in the next generation around the disciples of people like Niels Bohr, Max Heisenberg, others who basically said, no, we're going to use things a new way. We're going to approach things without assuming that there is a truth. And instead, we're going to just simply say all we need are probability statistics. And this is where the whole dispute with Albert Einstein versus Bohr around the question of does God play dice with the universe? That's where that whole thing emerged. So that whole conversation, it's a longer conversation.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
No, it's fine.
No problem,
It's a worthwhile thing to bring up, though. Definitely.
Okay, thank you. Matt, 30 seconds. There's a point that is very important about the Gestalt psychology. Never makes Gestalt psychology, which is something extraordinary, and Gestalt therapy, okay? Because Gestalt therapy by Jasper and the Esalen School in California and that stuff are fantasies, okay? It's they have the same name, Gestalt, but Gestalt psychology is something very serious in the process of discovery and of creativity. And Gestalt therapy is something from the hippie movement and so on. So don't mix the two, okay? Even if they have Gestalt in common.
Thank you. Very good disclaimer. All right. So yeah, let's get through this. Let me just do a little scroll. I'm just curious to see if it's possible. Okay, it's probably, we might. Yeah, it's just 2 pages. So let's do this. Let's try to get through this this section tonight, and I'll be happy. So let's end it. Begin it here with Wiener excluded the existence of. Paul, you wanna read that?
I would, but hang on a minute. It's all right. I just had to remove something from the screen. Wiener excluded the existence of cognition in human behavior. Cybernetics entertaining examples aside, for anyone with actual knowledge of the technological changes in physical economy at the point of production, Weiner's information theory dogma was a hoax from beginning to end. For anyone who had wrestled successfully with the fallacy of Kant's attack on Leibniz, as I had been seasoned in that subject since adolescence, the diagnosis and cure of Wiener's fraud was also evident. We must take this matter at this point. I emphasize that the basis for systematic understanding of the function of economic cycles depends on an adequate comprehension of the way in which the cognitive development or lack of such development of improved technologies determines the principal kinds of general characteristics of those cycles. My 1948 reaction against Weiner's information theory hoax was therefore essential in prompting my fascination with the task of discovery of solutions for the then hitherto unresolved problem of redefining the general notion of economic cycles in a physically meaningful, functional way. Qualitative improvements in productivity are reflected at the legendary, where am I? Point of production through the use of what I call technologies. Technologies, efficiently defined, can never be reduced to the form of what Weiner et al. Define as information. The development of any valid technology occurs as a byproduct of a special kind of proof of principle experiment. In the attempt to test an hypothetical form of universal physical principle, a successful series of experiments qualifying in total as universal pinpoints certain features of the relevant design of the experiment as situated within the medium employed for the chosen experimental subject. By abstracting, so to speak, this feature of the experimental design, the discovered principle can now be employed as a technology which reflects the relevant specific hypotheses application to the relevant medium.
Okay,
Maybe
let's
it's a
do
good moment to read
36.
Yeah, exactly. So note 36, whether Wiener knew that his information theory was a hoax or did not, I cannot tell. I have no proof that he was truly witting of the fraud on which this folly was premised, or whether, in the alternative, he was simply motivated to lie as lackeys are wont to do, to promote the reductionist fanaticisms of the Bertrand Russells, whose devotee he was. Notably, Wiener was not only a youthful devotee to the dogmas of Russell's Principia Mathematica, but radical positivist Wiener's role in the cybernetics project was the project of the Russell-founded unification of the sciences project, which featured the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation and such particularly odious examples of Russell's devotees as the dubious Margaret Mead and her sometime spouse, Gregory Bateson. I think that everyone know who is Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, eh?
I don't think everybody does, but
Well, Mead was a famous anthropologist, having written many fantastic things. And Gregory Bateson, let's say that he was primarily an operative rather than a psychologist.
yeah, he cut his teeth on MK Ultra.
Yeah,
among other things. Yeah.
Continuing.
Sure.
In addition, not only do such discovered technologies contribute an essential part to the increase of the effective productive powers of labor, it is the additional experimentation required to define ways in which previously known and newly discovered technologies might be combined, which points to the paradigmatic character of the relationship between original discovery of some universal physical principle and the increase of the productive powers of labor as if at the point of production.
All right. 37.
37. Okay, the introduction of the hoax of so-called benchmarking to industrial design more than a decade ago typifies the kind of ignorance of those characteristics of technology rampant among victims of the information theory cult.
Yeah, I think in that one, he's just referring to the practice of computer modeling when you're designing new machines or automobiles or whatever. And as people became more reliant upon more powerful software to do a lot of the work that human minds used to do previous to that, they started benchmarking. So it's like taking all of the information that was validated earlier with earlier designs, and instead of thinking about them, just simply including them into the computer modeling and then building on it like a foundation, despite the fact that the new thing you're building on, or the new advancement that you're trying to make, might not be compatible with the previous theories or ideas that you had formerly been using up until that moment, resulting in a wave of, not RVs, what do you call it? SUVs flipping over at sharp curves that was endemic throughout the late 90s, or these Blackstone tires that were, or a variety of really bad things were happening, causing people to die. And benchmarking was sort of the term used as part of that practice.
Expecting the world to conform to your computer programs.
Yeah, never works well.
Yeah, it works.
Modern numerology.
Modern numerology, in some ways, yeah.
Also, too, is that foundation, like, you could only build so much floors if the foundation, depending on the foundation, like, so, which was interesting that, if you want to build a 30-story to a 10-story, well, your foundation has to be quite a bit different. You can't build on, that's sort of what reminds me of what Matthew was saying, benchmarking, it's great in theory, but in reality, it's not going to hold.
That's a fair case study. Yeah. Good. I like it.
Continuing. The significance of that experience of modern industrial production is to be formulated as follows. The experimentally provable hypothesis upon which the generation of individual and combinable technologies depends is a product of a faculty specific to human individuals, the faculty of cognition, which the life's work of Russell and his acolytes Wiener and John von Neumann denies to exist. Immanuel Kant anticipated Russell, Wiener, and von Neumann in Kant's famous critiques. Russell, Wiener et al. Also went much further than Kant into the kind of radically Ockhamite nominalism associated with those more fanatical reductionists such as Ernst Mach and Russell himself. To understand both the anti-scientific character of concoctions such as information theory, one must focus on the characteristic, elementary problem presented to society by the same question addressed above. Do the individual powers of sense perception represent a truthful image of the real universe around us or not? Understanding this problem shows us the way towards discovering how technologies are generated. An understanding of the fuller implications of that matter leads us, in turn, to a conception of the functional meaning to be attributed to the term economic cycles. Are these notions of technology derivable from the raw statistical interpretation of sense perception, as consistency with Wiener's argument requires, or are they obtained, as they are in fact, by discovering ways for overcoming the fallacies inherent in a naive faith in sense perception? Contrary to the information theory cultists, in the history of ancient through modern philosophy and science, the effort to reach a rational form of conclusion in this matter of sense perception has been reduced to two general types of results. First, take a clinical look at the pathology called information theory from the standpoint of the transmission of knowledge of the way in which a principle was discovered and developed for use, excuse me, rather than as a matter of descriptive instructions to be learned, animal training fashion. Second, look at production and information theory from the standpoint of economy as a social process. To establish the basis for long-range forecasting, as I have done, it was necessary to define the general method for integrating all the most essential parts of the set of axiomatic-like constraints, which generate the effect to be recognized as a long-term physical economic cycle. Since all such constraints are defined for knowledge by the processes of cognition, it would be impossible to conceive an effective functional analysis of the characteristics of such cycles except through a rigorous examination of the most relevant features of cognition in general. Civilized society has a convenient working model for study of the characteristics of that function of individual cognition in the set of Socratic dialogues of Plato. In fact, those dialogues are, so far, the only known reasonably comprehensive model on which to premise a study of the general principles of cognitive behavior. Over the recent decades, I have used the case of Kepler's discoveries in astrophysics and crucial features taken from Nicholas of Cusar's De Docta Ignorantia as the pedagogical standpoint consistent with Plato's dialogues, from which to clarify the import of Plato's method for discovery of experimentally demonstrable universal physical principles. As I have emphasized in a number of published locations, we want to read the...
No, there's no note.
It's just a quote on where it is.
Yeah.
My approach overlaps the views of Vladimir Vernadsky in dividing physical space-time among three distinct but interconnected experimental phase spaces. The first and crudest of these phase spaces is the abiotic domain implied by experiments which ignore the existence of the effects of characteristically anti-entropic living or human cognitive processes. The second, relatively higher, is living processes and effects on the abiotic domain of those processes, which Vernadsky defines as the biosphere. The third, the highest, is effects on both the abiotic and biosphere domains, which are uniquely products of human cognitive invention, the domain which Vernadsky identifies as the noosphere. On the proof of the existence of the noosphere, I accept Vernadsky's notion of the experimental proof of this. However, as I have indicated, my own views on the internal characteristics of the action of the noosphere differ from that of his published accounts in a significant way. This threefold set of phase spaces then serves as the basis for a general theory of physical economy. The characteristics which define long-range cycles in physical economy are to be comprehended as the combination of human actions and the reactions they evoke from among and within each of the three phase spaces. These cycles are determined by the physical differential geometry cohering with the implicitly axiomatic features of the combined universal phase spaces. In the immediate discussion on the subject of information theory, the point to be emphasized is that, in truth, science must explain everything in terms of experimentally demonstrable principles, always relating any such principle to a certain higher class known as universal physical principles. The relatively unique kind of common significance of my own and Vernadsky's conception of the noosphere is that this approach enables us to grasp all combined abiotic, biotic, and cognitive processes as both respectively distant and yet efficiently interconnected from the standpoint of a generalized notion of experimental development and application of universal physical principles. We must do this while considering each and all of these types as something commonly experienced in terms of evidence, which is equally a set of physical products of relevant activity. Vernadsky's doctrine would agree that it is cognitive action, as by discovery of an experimentally validated hypothesis, which generates new human knowledge of universal physical principles. His views I accept as corresponding to my own, insofar as we are considering the relationship between experimental proof of principle and the origin of new technologies subsequently introduced as effective innovations in both productive processes and product design. These cognitively generated discoveries of universal principles, from which technologies are generated as byproducts, have the effect of changing the physical geometry of the physical domain in which human actions are located. In other words, we respond efficiently to our discovery that a previously unknown universal physical principle was sitting out there in the real universe, as if waiting for us to discover and utilize its existence. I won't interrupt. Let's continue. I could say something about that, maybe later. It is by these qualities of changes in our behavior, and in only that way, that mankind is able to increase its power to exist in and over the universe. Indeed, we have reached the state of successful population of the planet, that society could not continue to exist without generating and applying to production without limit new discoveries of universal physical principle. Zero technological growth would be generalized attrition and rapid extinction of most of the current levels of the human population through the most horrible holocaust ever imagined. The recognition of these discoveries, the recognition of these discoveries and either cooperative action to employ those discoveries and either cooperative action or to abhor them rather, determines the general potential for increase or decrease of the effective productive powers of labour of an economy. In my reaction against the obvious fraud of Wiener's information theory on this account, I focused not only upon the cognitive features of the generation of technologies of design of processes and products, but on the matter of the mode by means of which cooperation in discovering and employing technologies is fostered among human beings considered in the totality of their social existence as human beings.
I'm so happy. All right, we made it. We made it to the next section, which we'll pick up next week. The role of art in economics and morals, which looks to be a very, very juicy section. So far,
Yes.
this was a lot. There's a lot of content in this particular section we read today. Obviously, no one is supposed to get everything. It's supposed to be a broad brushstroke to set up. You could almost build a curriculum. You could build a university curriculum around a lot of this content that could then be unpacked in a semester for each, paragraph, frankly, which is wonderful. But were there any thoughts or questions based on some of the content we had just looked at today that people want to get off their chest?
Yeah, I've got an example. I've got an example which I find intriguing. I'll go back and read a paragraph too. These cognitively generated discoveries of universal physical principles from which technologies are generated as byproducts have the effect of changing the physical geometry of the physical domain in which human actions are located. In other words, we respond efficiently to our discovery that the previously unknown universal physical principle was sitting out there in the real universe as if waiting for us to discover and utilize its existence. Now, in one particular area of science, which I know you're acquainted with, we've spoken about it before, Matthew, that's the electric universe. I was watching something by a guy, I think his name is Michael Levin, and he's put up some things I've seen before on the discovery of biophotons existing within living cells. In other words, light existing in the darkness of the human body. Now, in the latest one that I saw, there was a bunch of evidence given in relation to planarian worms, which are in essence immortal. You can chop them all into 200, 300, 2,000 pieces, and every single one of those pieces somehow contains the template for the entirety of the planarian worm and will regrow. Now, the interesting part about it is that when I say make a statement like that, I mean, 2 weeks ago before I see this, that wouldn't have, seemed strange to me. I would simply have said, yeah, well, inside every single genome, there is a template of existence for that organism. But the point of the presentation was to prove that they were going outside of genetics and using bioelectrical templates to recreate the bodies of not only planarian worms, but of tadpoles and frogs, to change them, to alter them, to sometimes alter them in, I don't want to say bad ways or anything like that, but ways that are not good for the organism, that will compromise that organism's development. But here you have an emerging theory based on, the electric universe once again, which, despite all of the work that's being done on that one, we're barely scratching the surface. That's the kind of feeling that I'm getting on it. You have a complete template of biological creation and control of like body shape, the functions of body, the head, the tail, et cetera, that sits on top of or outside of the genetic framework that we've all come to assume is the ultimate order in the biological universe, that it is the determining software for life in the universe. And along comes somebody who says, well, hang on a minute, maybe there's actually something else. Maybe there's something we're only just beginning to understand, that has a role in, I don't want to say determining, but influencing, and let's say determining the outcomes of certain biological processes. Now, what it also does, being of an electrical nature, it puts it into the realm of that, again, something that has come up in the last 10, 20 years, the idea that the entirety of the universe is conscious, that consciousness pervades the entire universe. Well, if that's true, lots of speculation about, how does that consciousness work throughout the entire universe? On what level, at what scales, are there different principles involved at different scales, et cetera, et cetera. And here you have a new emerging theory, which might actually give you a foundation for a whole different way of looking at the way in which, if I use the word consciousness here, it's simply because I don't have a better one, universal consciousness can be seen to exist at, all scales, especially the minute ones.
Yeah.
If true, and I have to qualify it, so this is something that I've only seen in the last week, so I haven't had a chance to really look at it in depth, but it really floored me. It's like, Jesus, we're going to leave genetics behind now. Where's that going to leave the ruling class? All of their mRNA vaccines are completely redundant before they were ever invented.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the thing, right? I mean, like science unshackled really would be so boundless in the discoveries that will be made again, if we can only get these blocks out of the way. But what you think about just the amount of incredible rates of discoveries that should have happened that were derailed, sabotaged, undermined by the promotion of this false way of defining life science around some material molecular, this is the idea of reductionism that we began our paper with today. The idea of reductionism in biology is just the idea that the organisms, whether as individuals or whether as ecosystems, any system as a living system, can be thought of as the sum total of its parts, and that you just start adding up from the bottom up the elements that, we are the sum total of like whatever 80 quadrillion cells in our bodies. And just by adding cells together, you'll somehow get an idea of the organism's character and identity, which is never true. That's maybe true for a computer where you can just keep on adding elements and then get a whole, but it's not true for anything that is of a nonlinear character like human beings, life, or anything of that sort. So when you appreciate the fact that there are these fields, these invisible but real fields that have an electromagnetic characteristic that go far beyond the simple limits of our skin, which are influenced by fields of the Schumann resonance, right? The field of the Earth, the Van Allen belts, which influences not just weather systems, weather systems, ice ages, all of these things, as well as volcanism, earthquakes, other things are all being influenced by these things, which are themselves being influenced by the magnetic fields of the sun, which is being influenced by the field of the entire galaxy, which the sun is a part of, which is being influenced by the cluster of galaxies that our galaxy is a part of, So everything, you can't say that anything can be conceived of as in a vacuum outside of these broader subtle processes, which we've barely scratched the surface of. Like we know a little bit, but we know far less than a lot of the egotistical, modern peer-reviewed journals profess to know about. Like, when they show you these cutouts of like, this is inside the sun, this is what we know, and they show you these like, these pies just taken out of the sun or the earth, or and it's like, yeah, we know that 95% of the universe is dark matter, and the rest is dark energy, and they can't even define what these things are properly. And you discover when you start poking at it, it's just these are mathematical fictions created to justify models that they don't want to leave behind because they're too uncreative and cowardly to think about thinking in a new way. But yeah, it's there's a lot there.
And I don't know if you remember the extraordinary sentence from one of the book by LaRouche, which is in defense of common sense. Efficient cause is substance, and substance is efficient cause.
Mm.
And when Paul was talking of the possibility of consciousness as being the basic foundational substance of the universe, that sentence by LaRouche, for me, might be something glorious that would be enshrined in the future, okay? Efficient cause is substance, and substance is efficient cause, in the sense that, of course, you can try to discover the intermediate levels of causality, but at the deepest level, the structure of the substance of the universe contains within itself its multi-levels manifestations.
Right. Well, there was a really great scientist named Dr. Robert Moon, who was a pioneer. I think he developed the first particle accelerator, the cyclotron, back in the early 30s in Chicago. And he worked with LaRouche for a little while in the 80s before he died. And he came up with a new model of he was an atomic physicist. And he came up in the 1980s after reviewing Kepler, because he didn't believe Kepler. He didn't believe LaRouche was right when LaRouche was saying people need to let go of Newton and revisit Kepler's method to redefine their idea of what gravitation actually is as a harmonic coherence function. And he was one of the few scientists in those days who decided to be honest enough to do the work and read Kepler, and was blown away. And he reconstructed a brand new model using Kepler's nested polyhedra, the 5 platonic solids, to construct not a final answer, but a very strong, reasonable model of the placement of the atoms, or the elements as we find them outlined on the periodic table of elements, that resolve many paradoxes that are not resolved in the conventional models. And he had, like, people have probably seen the image of the dodecahedron, or the cube, which contains an octahedron, which contains a tetrahedron. Inside that is a dodecahedron. Inside that is an icosahedron. And you can have at the vertices, each of the vertices contains a special place where one of the elements exists, and you can add nested solids on top of that. Anyway, it's a really beautiful thing. And he made a point in a lecture I was listening to that no matter where one looks, if you're tuned to this, no matter where a truth seeker will look, they will find God in the smallest of places. And so you think you're looking at the non-living world, but you're actually finding traces of God's existence, because you're finding reason, you're finding harmony, you're finding coherence, even in the very small. You never see chaos in a pure state anywhere. You just see something I don't understand yet, and we call it chaos as a momentary thing. But the realistic approach would be, it's something I don't understand yet. I got to think a new way to figure out why this is not chaotic, right? There's something else beyond what I know. And then you're free.
It seems to me what I was talking about before, I could put it slightly differently, that when it comes to consciousness in the universe, one of the things that seems to be happening is that there are modes of communication that you could call a form of consciousness at different scales that we are beginning to understand. Now, I tend to reflect on the material that I look at in the electric universe theory, because it fascinates me and I'm spending a lot of time with that material. But another one from last week, and I wish I could remember the guy's name, but it comes up with a fourth state of water.
Gerald Pollack.
Yeah, Pollock, that's right. I found that one fascinating too. And again, at this stage of our development in science, to postulate the idea that there are not only the 3 main forms of water that we know, liquid, solid, and gas, but there's now a fourth state, a negatively charged state of water that is at the interface between water and everything that it touches, which must have, I don't want to use the word deterministic, but must have a level of communication in operation at that scale, or perhaps just beginning to understand. Which gets us back to one of the central questions here is, how do we understand truth and everything like that? Because at every turn, it's like we keep rediscovering more and more and more, which to me simply says, and it gets back to Susan's idea of love, if you like, that the universe is a living construct. It's not static, it's not fixed, it changes all of the time, and even right down to what we're doing at this moment, we're participating in that change. We're recreating the universe in the image of God in our own way, and however small and however seemingly unimportant it might be, it is a contribution to a living universe, or at least that's how I'll take it.
Yeah. And I would say that LaRouche is presenting how to go to that, because once again, he stressed the fact that you need to be rooted in higher principles, make hypotheses, and create precisely experiments to stress what you think is about the reality of the universal substance precisely. And I want to show that also he's a very good teacher and Platonic writer, okay? Because today we were reading about Principia Mathematica versus the theorem of Godel, which invalidated the fact of the fantasy of the fake democratic man, meaning the epistemological level of Dianoa 1. And in the next section is the role of art in economics and morals, okay, which is exactly the level of Dianoa 2, the first level of the first universal forms, beauty. So you can see that from a teaching perspective, it's very, very coherent.
Yeah. And now, the thing that I think is also very important about this particular section that we read in terms of cybernetics and information theory, which is so much more important to realize what has been done under these. What cybernetics is it's a science of controls. It's a science of governance. Management of systems. And it's specifically created, and that's why it was promoted by the Massey Foundation, which had also been one of the primary conduits promoting throughout the 30s eugenics research for a very similar reason. Is that it wasn't just that it was applied after World War II during the Cold War to manage the Cold War, and it was brought in after Stalin was dead. It was brought into the governance structures of the Soviet Union under Khrushchev. It was brought in, Pierre Elliott Trudeau gave a speech in the 60s calling for cybernetics to be the solution to all of our problems. This is what he used to reorganize the entire Canadian government around the Privy Council office in 1970. It was done by Rand Corporation, all of whom were being organized by people like Albert Volsheder and a variety of other former Trotskyites, which Cynthia Chung has written a lot about, who are all devoted believers in the Principia Mathematica, as well as cybernetics. And they brought that into the entire management of, again, the entire Cold War, the entire building up of the post-1971 economic systems. And it's entirely based upon the belief in equilibrium. This assumption that all systems in a natural, healthy state don't change. That is a healthy system. Now, that is toxic and poisonous, because what happens when you're a creative human being living in a system? Well, we change the system because we've just made a discovery that we then translate to the system as a whole. This is what Kepler did. This is what Ben Franklin did. This is what makes human beings, that gives us our purpose, meaning, and vitality, right? So the very thing that gives us meaning is the thing which is seen as the most unhealthy, disruptive thing to be annihilated at all cost, in the belief in a Manichaean dualism, this perfect balance, right? And the Cold War played into that very well, of a system of constant no change, no new technologies, no new discoveries would be permitted in to upset the pristine balance. And so you can see how this could be really dangerous today, when we have 8 billion people desperately in need of the application of existent technologies, but also the advancement of new technologies. And we're being told, no, we're not allowed to do that. It upsets the balance. We're already 7 billion too many. So you've got this very, very destructive effect that happens. So, and it's all there from just basic false ideas of what physics is, and it seems very innocuous and innocent on the surface. Bertrand Russell was a nice theoretician, mathematician, philosopher. He won the Nobel Prize, and so the people have very warm, fuzzy feelings, but they don't realize, actually, when LaRouche says he was the most evil man of the 20th century, he's not joking. like there's something actually to that. It's not hyperbole.
So he's a democratic man, or however that word is that Quan uses.
Yeah, the worst.
Oh, yes.
The worst kind.
Yes. Thank you, Susan, for that. Because after all, that man was born in the British aristocracy, but in reality, his true nature is democratic, not aristocratic, on the contrary, in the true sense of aristocratic and in the true sense of democratic.
Mhm. Yep, exactly. Well, this is
Sometimes we say they've been educated far beyond their intellect.
ooh, that's a good one. Susan, I'm keeping that. That's great.
Yeah. Wow. They had the intellect stuff with things, but they have not been educated.
Hmm. I just shared one thing before we go. I just shared one little thing on Max Planck's musical space-time and the derailing of the flow of quantum dynamics by the Copenhagen school's interpretation in the 1920s. It's a little essay I'd written a little while ago with a bunch of videos interspliced within it that people should enjoy. So that's the newest link that I just threw out there. And yeah, I think next week, well, this coming Sunday, we have Kwan, who's going to be presenting this Sunday afternoon presentation for the RTF. And then after that is going to be Jerry Therrien the week afterwards. Kwan, do you want to say a little something about your class so far, or you want to leave it a surprise?
Oh, I prefer simply to say the title, The Four Seeds, Timeless Education and Universal History.
That's beautiful. Okay, so that'll be Sunday.
Will it be 2 p.m. or 4 p.m.?
What do you want?
Let me think. Is it a big deal if it's 4 p.m.? I know usually you put it at 2, but
the only person it might affect negatively might be Dasha, who is like 15 hours in the future or something. Dasha, what time is it for you now? It's like, this is the morning for you, right?
It's 10:29 in the morning.
And
okay,
so,
okay.
that might not be bad.
I'm yeah. At 10:29 for 4 p.m. And there's a 7 hours of difference between here and Russia. I think so.
Wait, no. Oh, I thought that you were asking me what time it is for me now, but
Oh no.
PM for
But
you is 4 a.m. for me.
oh,
Okay, that's a bit early for Dasha, but then again, so 2 p.m. would also be pretty bad for her too. So don't worry about it. All right, so let's do 4 p.m. and it'll be recorded. Or Dasha, if you want to wake up at some ungodly early hour, that's okay too. But either way, it'll be 4 p.m. Sunday. That sounds good.
okay. Ciao.
All right, bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao. Okay.